Thank you, Ian. Welcome to our first in a series of 5 discussions about ESG. And for those who are new to ESG, everybody's new to ESG. So first, before we start, I wanted to thank Malcolm Pobjoy and his team from Osborne Clark. Thank you very much. And also to Lowton Kornblit, their team here at Venable. Without your work, we wouldn't be here today. I did mention that this is really kind of the first in a series that we're moving forward with here at Venable. We have a discussion here of the US and the EU and a number of comparisons. We'll also roll out other seminars, one on construction, one on environmental, one on nonprofit systems, another comparison with Latin America and where the US system is going. And we invite you to those things as it moves forward. I would like to introduce our esteemed panel and tell you where we're going. We're going to have basically an 8-minute introduction with Matthew Quant and Matt Germain, 2 on my left, and then we'll move into 3 substantive 15-minute blocks. The first block is going to talk about regulatory issues, and we'll have George Kostolampros and Matt Germain again talking about a US perspective and an EU perspective. So from the US perspective, we'll be talking about getting our house in order, scope 1, 2, and 3, what this all means, safe harbors, recent rulings and ESG amendments that the SEC has talked about, proposed changes. And from the US side, we're going to be talking, from the EU, UK side, we're going to be talking about the 4 key EU regulations, how they're complex, and how complex it's becoming over there, non-financial reporting, heavy regulatory schemes, and how things are really moving quickly. In the second 15-minute block, we're going to be talking about corporate governance trends and a different. We're going to pivot with Katie Vickery and Mike Sheehan. Mike is from Venable. He's going to be talking about US best practices and regulatory continuums, 50 states and 50 different regulatory regimes, and how do you deal with those issues and trends and developments. And then from the EU side, Katie will be talking about EU, UK rules and how you approach them from a company perspective, trends in both the UK and in Europe, with a focus on supply chains, regulatory expectations from the corporate perspective, and a bit of eco-labeling and green regulation. And the last 15-minute block, Katie will then roll right into that from an EU UK perspective, followed by our own Kelly Johnson from Venable, and she'll be talking about the US perspective. If there's time, we'll have questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt and Matthew to talk about the introduction of what ESG is.
Matt and Matt show. I don't want to assume anyone here is an expert. I don't think any of us are yet, as the concept of ESG is still developing. But the E, the S, and the G stand for environmental, social, and governance, as most of you probably know. I should start off by saying I work with our corporate group in the DC office, Venable's DC office, and we are seeing ESG come up a lot more in the context of M&A transactions, in the questions that people are asking and the answers that people are looking for. The environmental piece of the 3 definitely gets the highest billing, I think, because in the mind's eye, there's most to attach to that, and the concept of emissions, air and water pollutants, waste management. People can readily attach to that. The S and the G are in our minds of equal importance. The S stands for social, and in the context of the corporate world can come increasingly in the topics of labor rights, health and safety, gender diversity, anti-corruption, those types of things, mainly the impact on the community surrounding the corporation. And then governance is within the corporation. People have thought about this a lot in the terms of shareholders' rights, staggered boards, data transparency, business ethics, and executive compensation. So those are the general topics. But a lot of this starts off on whether people think that this is a fad that is not here to stay, or whether they are already a believer that this is something of corporate importance. So I would be interested to know of those in the audience, not that you have to commit to one far end of the spectrum or the other, but who falls more on the I'm not sure and still figuring this out side. I don't know whether this is something that is going to stick around. I feel like this might be a fad. Anybody in the audience identify more on that side of the spectrum? Okay, I see a couple hands. Who is on the other side of the spectrum that they are here because they think this is something that is going to stick around and they're interested in learning more? Okay, so it seems like more of the hands in the room are on that side of the fence. We find that it could be that many of you are the sole believer in a sea of skeptics at your company, and so the idea of bringing this knowledge back could be of particular importance. As far as why I think or we think that ESG is here to stay, the public opinion is really shifting in that direction, and we are seeing that bubble up in terms of regulatory structures and regimes that are coming into play. But at the most basic level, people and consumers are desiring this of their companies. An increasing number of people are willing to pay more for a product or a service that comes from a firm that has ESG quality or compliance. There have been financial studies done that say that companies with high scores in the area of ESG absolutely have access to lower cost of capital. And so from a profit perspective, it does move the needle in that sense. But as far as what people are looking for, or why this topic is of increasing importance, I think the picture that I like to have in my head, or that I want to paint to you, is in old Western movies when they build the movie sets and they have the saloon or the hotel or things that are built out of wood, but they're only a foot thick or a half meter thick. People are increasingly looking at companies to say, is what you're doing in these three areas just a foot thick? Are you putting up some type of facade, or are you backing up what you were saying? Not just in the concept of greenwashing, maybe people have heard that term specifically in the context of the environmental, but we are also seeing that come into play in the S and the G. People looking behind the scenes to say, is what you are putting forth in claims about your social responsibility actually something that you are doing? So Alex gave an overview of who and what is going to be talked about later. But as far as why I would say everyone needs to listen, every company needs to listen, is to dispel the notion that this somehow only applies to public companies, or that this only applies to companies who have big environmental impacts or emissions, or that this only applies to companies that put out the tout the line that they are ESG compliant. And I think what I have seen that this really does apply to everyone, obviously in the public space, because there is a regulatory compliance component, as we're going to talk about later. But anyone with a board, anyone with a customer has somebody that is going to be looking at and scrutinizing their company from that perspective. The SEC has said they plan to increasingly police against private companies. Obviously, the larger ones will be the first to be looked at. But that space from a compliance perspective, like I said, we're seeing it in the M&A space, where people are asking questions or looking for target companies that have these ESG compliance regimes in place. And lastly, the customers are looking for companies and being willing to give business to companies that can explain why and what they are doing in this space. As far as the ways, and I'll finish with this, the ways that one might encounter the topic of ESG, depending on the industry that you're in. People think this is industry specific. It will really come every year when you were talking about your annual board meetings, when you were electing your boards, the annual shareholders meeting and votes. It will occur even before that when you set up your company and talk about the type of entity that you want to form. If anybody has particular interest in the topic of public benefit corporations or B Corps, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards about that. On an ongoing basis, it will come up in the context of regulatory compliance. We talked about greenwashing earlier, also specifically in the space of investment funds, and questioning whether certain types of investments are actually doing what they are saying in picking out the specific funds in which they're investing. And then in the end context of M&A and company valuation. So ESG, in summary, is something that every type of company will experience at a variety of instances throughout its existence, and we don't see it going away.
Thanks, Matthew. So, morning, everyone. My name's Matt Germain. I'm a partner at Osborne Clarke. I head up our environment and sustainability team. It's lovely to be with you in person. Sorry, am I not coming through? Peter.
Matt, we have 2 more minutes on the intro.
Okay, I will be quick. But what Matthew has said, from a UK and European perspective, there's not a huge amount I would add. The picture is incredibly similar. To an extent, we have seen, certainly over the last 12 to 18 months, a huge level of interest from our clients around ESG. I think that the bit I would sort of overlay is kind of why have we got here? And I think it's important to understand that we saw the period of the pandemic as a time where companies and boards definitely, as many of us did in our personal lives, a period of introspection and sort of reimagining what a company is, what is its purpose. And we have this concept of the kind of good corporate citizen, and that's definitely what we've seen coming through. And the key bit of it, and Matthew touched upon, none of this would be happening if there wasn't now value being attracted to a company which has a high ESG performance. You know, that is the key thing. What we've got at the moment and have seen for the last sort of year to last 12 to 24 months, an incredible amount of ESG funds being raised in the marketplace. And you've got out there a kind of wall of capital which wants to go somewhere. And investors are looking at companies which are more advanced on ESG, and certainly we're seeing that in Europe and the UK, as being the safe haven, as being the places where they want to invest their money. So particularly pension funds are looking to move money into companies which are performing better on ESG. Now, in order to have that kind of transition, and that's a phrase we hear a lot in our part of the world, to kind of move that money from one place to another, you need metrics by how investors can measure a company's ESG rating, if you like. So we've seen a rise in kind of ESG raters, if you like. But you also need law. You also need some commonality. You need companies to be regulated almost equitably in the same sort of way, so investors can make prudent decisions about where they're going to move their money. And that's, in a sense, it's been the investment community that have been leading the charge for more regulation, because they are the ones who are demanding it. In terms of where we're seeing, I guess, the sort of money being moved, and so the UK, France, and Germany and Europe are probably the markets where we've got the most advanced sort of ESG frameworks, if you like. But then you've got other jurisdictions that we come into contact with, Japan, Australia. They have some very advanced ESG frameworks as well. Often it's different triggers. For the UK and France, the trigger was definitely around, as Matthew said, the kind of emphasis on environment and climate change. We had COP26. That was an incredible stimulus, if you like, from a policy and regulatory perspective. In Australia, you've got some very large pension funds, teachers' pension funds, which are very influential in demanding policy moves and certain frameworks. They're the ones that are demanding that there are, more advanced ESG systems, because they are wanting the money they're investing to go into companies which are performing well in that space. So that's all I'll say. But hopefully that sets a nice introduction for the rest of the session.
Great, thanks. So why don't we move to the next the first substantive 15-minute block on regulatory. Turn it to George, and again, you'll see Matt in a sec.
Okay. That was a great transition, Matt. Thank you. Because here comes the regulators. From the SEC perspective, the SEC proposed a climate-related disclosure rule in March of 2022. Got a lot of attention. It was a somewhat controversial proposal. It was a 3-1 decision by the commission itself. If you take a look at Commissioner Hester Pierce's dissent, which is unusual for a commissioner to file a dissent, it's interesting. The title of the dissent is "We are not the Securities and Environment Commission, at least not yet." One thing I would focus on, if you read her dissent, is I think the main part of her dissent is mostly that, look, if ESG related, climate related disclosures are material, there are already rules out there that require disclosures. But as Matt and Matthew, I think, pointedly, set forth is this is important to investors, and there's got to be a set of rules out there, and that's what's being proposed. So let me quickly go through what the climate-related disclosures as to issuers requires. It's basically three categories. One is disclosures, risk-related disclosures, climate-related risks, and their material impacts to the company. Governance disclosures. What from a governance standpoint is the issuer doing? Then the second part of this category is greenhouse gas emissions, and this is what are the emissions that are resulting from the company and the company's businesses. I'll get into specifically what those mean, because I think that's where a lot of the controversy on this rule comes from. And then third is information about climate-related targets and goals and transition plans, if there are any. So let me go to the emission scopes. This comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an accounting and reporting standard. So under the GHG protocols, there are three scopes of emissions. One is scope 1, and that's basically emissions from the company's own machinery or methane emissions. So just think of it, it's coming from what the company is producing itself. Scope 2 emissions is similar. It's generation of electricity purchased or consumed by the company. And then scope 3 emissions, which is the more controversial part of this. This is indirect emissions. And what does that mean? These are emissions that are not controlled or owned by the company. Think emissions associated with production and transportation of goods the company purchased from its suppliers, emissions from employees commuting or traveling on business, and the processing or use of the registrant's products by third parties, for instance, automobiles. So what does it mean? These scope 1 and 2 emissions are disclosures that are required under the rules. Scope 3 disclosures are required only if they are material and only if the company has set emissions targets. So that's something to be mindful of where do you fit, what you need to disclose. So scope 1 and 2 are required, scope 2 potentially. Then let me go to the timing on the SEC disclosure rule. Assuming the proposed rule is adopted by the end of this year, then scope 1, scope 2, and the disclosures are required for fiscal year 2023. So that means filed in 2024. Scope 3 emissions, which are a little bit lagging behind, would be fiscal year 2024. So for 2025 filings. And let me go over some key aspects to the SEC disclosure rule. There is a safe harbor for liability for scope 3 emissions disclosures. So what does that mean? They're forward-looking statements. There is that safe harbor there. So think securities class action cases. That would be an outright protection from securities class actions. There is an exemption from scope 3 emissions disclosures for small reporting companies. So again, that would be depending on what the public float of the company is. And then, as I mentioned, forward-looking statement safe harbors would apply basically throughout the board to all of the disclosures relating to climate-related disclosures, assuming they are forward-looking statements. So what does that mean? If you're disclosing what your emissions are right now, those aren't forward-looking statements. Anything in the future would be. So that's for the issuer. The SEC followed up real quickly. So the issuer rule came out, and the proposed rule came out in March 2022. In May 2022, the SEC also proposed rule amendments to investment advisor rules and investment company rules relating to ESG disclosures. And this followed some greenwashing cases that the SEC brought. Again, greenwashing cases where advisors were representing that they were focused on investments in ESG related funds, and those disclosures, at least from the SEC's perspective, were not correct. So the proposed rules, what do they do? They require specific disclosures on ESG strategies and fund prospectuses. They introduce a standard table for ESG funds to disclose information. And require certain environmentally focused funds to disclose GHG emissions. So for these rules, focus on the funds that are out there that are touting, or investment companies that are touting their ESG focus, what this is putting before is a standards proposed set of rules where there are requirements of what that actually means. As Matthew said, what does ESG mean? And some support behind that, because investors are taking notice of whether funds are focused on ESG. So, I guess I'll conclude is, I think ESG focus is not going away. Whether you're a public company or investment advisor or investment company, that's clearly going to be important, and it's going to affect your business. But I think also for those private companies out there, because those companies are going to require information from those companies. For instance, scope 3 emissions.
Yep.
You're going to need to get information from your suppliers, your customers, to the extent they are private companies. Those issuers are going to require that information. And if you want to do business with those issuers, you're going to have to provide that information. It's really important. Same thing with ESG funds, right? If you're going to be investing in any private company, that private company is going to need to provide that information as well. That's what I have.
And George, I think you printed out a couple of fact sheets I saw in the back
Sure.
on those rules.
Yeah. So the SEC put together a fact sheet for each one of its proposed rules, about two pages and 1 page, I think, on the investment advisor. Really quick hitting on a summary of what the rule proposes. Good thing to look at, but look, the devil's all in the details. How is this going to go forward? It's going to be a lot of costs associated with this, especially with the issuer rule. And that's one of the things that Commissioner Pierce, basically in her dissent, brings up. But as I think we all believe up here, is this isn't going away, and it's just another part of doing business going forward.
Yeah, and that SEC rule, just for everyone's information, that had an enormous amount of press attention in the UK and EU, because our markets were very much looking to what is the US going to do, and that's been, and that sent a really positive signal. And in a sense, so that the sort of laws that we've got in the EU and the UK, we have the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I know has been voluntarily adopted by a lot of companies globally, because that's something which was sort of developed by the G20, G7. And that is now mandatory in the UK. It has a similar emphasis that is about requiring companies to do some quite detailed annual reporting, scenario planning, impact analysis, risk analysis around what climate change means for a business. And again, it goes back to that point. So it provides real-time data. And this is what a lot of this is about data, getting information in the hands of investors so they can assess investee companies. And the whole emphasis on scope 3 emissions, as George said, is huge. That is one of the most difficult things to manage. So in terms of the regulatory position in the EU and UK, it's been sort of coming, I guess, from about 2015 when we had the Paris Agreement. That was probably the thing which started to move things on. Groups of investors got together and started really pushing government and regulators hard to come up with some hard regulation. In 2018, we got something in the EU called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which is a similar thing. It requires companies to sort of report on their sort of environmental, social factors, sort of environmental protection, social responsibility, human rights, anti-bribery, corruption, board diversity, that sort of thing. But it only really impacts quite a small group of companies, probably about 12,000 companies across the EU. So in order to kind of correct that, we've got something coming called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which comes into force 2024. That expands the scope of obligated companies. It expands some of the disclosure requirements. The real difference with that is that it requires the disclosures to be audited and have assurance behind them. So the kind of fact checking is real. And I think importantly, I guess from a US audience, it also mandates non-EU companies that have a substantial presence in an EU jurisdiction, and also companies which have securities listed on EU regulated markets. So this directive is going to be a little bit more global in a sense. So that's definitely one to watch. Very briefly, on regulatory, there's also a bit more around environmental sustainability. We have something called the SFDR, the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Requirements. That's very much aimed at financial market participants, where effectively they have now got to label their funds with a sort of sustainability tag. They have to kind of assess them as to how sustainable they are. And in order to do that, and again, that's giving transparency to investors. So how sustainable is that fund? Is it an Article 6 fund? Is it an Article 9 fund? They're some different demarcations. But in order to do that, one thing that we've had brought in the EU and is also coming into the UK is something called a taxonomy, which is effectively, it's all very well having all of these disclosure requirements, but there's a need that everyone is saying the same thing and calling the thing the same thing, if that makes sense. So how do you determine what is sustainable? And that is what the taxonomy is doing. It's like a great big dictionary. And any disclosures made in relation to any of these regulations has to be what's called taxonomy aligned. And again, it comes back to the point I say again, it gives that information, transparency information to investors. So those 4 pieces of regulation are the things which are really driving things forward. In the UK, because obviously we are not in the EU anymore, there are certain divergences. The one thing I'd probably mention, and there's not a lot of time, you touched on it there, George, we've got net zero transition plans are going to become mandatory in the UK for large companies to actually publicly disclose how that company is going to transition to net zero. The UK government has set a very ambitious net zero target by 2050, and absolutely rightly, companies are going to be at the forefront in helping to deliver that. So there will be a real focus on these net zero transition plans for companies to show and demonstrate how they are transitioning their businesses, because a lot of this is it's what this transformation is around ESG is we not only have a kind of planet emergency, but the global economy is massively going to be stretched and stressed by all of these factors such as climate change, and companies need to be, and are, I think, and want to be at the forefront of that.
Thanks, Matt. I think we're about a minute behind, but we'll make it up in Q&A. And so Mike Sheehan, Katie Vickery, we're going to transition out our second substantive block about corporate governance and trends.
We'll make up a little time. My name is Mike Sheehan. I'm a partner in the Baltimore office with focus in capital markets, and advising board of directors, which is where my interest in ESG originally came from. And I'm just going to talk about some sources of ESG in the US market, because ESG, as you guys know, is not really a precise legal term, but it's more of a hodgepodge of different things that people are thinking about, and it means different things to different people. And someone used the phrase a continuum of regulation before, and that was really true, because a lot of things start out as maybe best practice and eventually become mandatory through regulation from a couple different sources. And today's best practice can be tomorrow's regulations. So in the US corporate context, the foundation for all of this would be state law, where the entity is incorporated. And normally that just focused on the G side of ESG, what you can have in your organization documents, how you can organize your board of directors. But recently we've seen at least some attempts to expand that, where California passed some laws in the past 2 years, sort of mandating diversity at the board level, not for companies incorporated in Maryland, but for companies that do their business.
You're talking about California.
Yeah. Where their headquarters or principal place of business is California. And that was a really big change in the corporate world that a state would try to regulate that way, because normally you would say, well, that's up to the company's state of incorporation. Now, both those rules were struck down, but the way they were struck down was interesting, because they didn't reference the decisions striking it down, didn't reference the so-called internal affairs doctrine, saying, well, you can't regulate if you're a Delaware corporation that has your headquarters in California can't really regulate the board of directors. So the fact that they kind of were silent in that area, to us, makes it seem like, well, more states are going to try that. This isn't going to be the last time that states try to put some E&S regulations into their corporate law. After state law, The SEC for public companies is again the big one, and George did an excellent job talking about the climate change rules. That's really one of the biggest things that's come down in the past couple of years. The other recent new rule from the SEC is universal proxy card, which is going to start affecting annual meetings in 2023, and we still don't know how that's going to affect activist investors or proxy contests. After SEC, you've got the securities exchanges, which do have mandatory rules. New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, of course, are two big ones. They don't regulate as much. NASDAQ recently did have a rule mandating gender diversity on the board, and that was probably the biggest change in either of their rules since Dodd-Frank Act in 2011. So it is coming through, and wouldn't be surprised to see more. And then as we kind of move over to more voluntary or best practices, a lot of popular voluntary reporting regimes that companies are thinking about when they're disclosing. This can be in their proxy statements. A lot of larger companies are putting out what they call sustainability reports. It's totally optional, but it is sort of almost a marketing document to show what they're doing. The two most popular ones that we see are TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standard Boards. Now, again, those are best practice, but what we're seeing with this SEC rule, I think the final SEC rule is going to have a huge overlap with some of these, especially TCFD. So it kind of shows that one generation's best practice is going to get adopted, and maybe sooner rather than later in the climate change area. Someone mentioned net zero earlier, and that I think is another big one where, 3 years ago, we didn't see a lot of companies talking about that in their proxy statements. Last year, people were talking about, all right, let's disclose how we can be net zero by 2050. And this year, we're saying, well, let's disclose how we can be net zero by 2030. So the pace is really accelerating. Another best practice that's coming up is companies' EEO-1 forms, which is typically private, about data relating to the makeup of your employees. That's normally submitted only to the Department of Labor, but we're seeing a lot of companies choose to disclose that publicly to give more data about diversity, not just at the board or management level, but across the entire employee base. And then a couple other sources where this is coming from that, again, are not mandatory, but can be pretty powerful is in the public company space. You've got your proxy advisory services. And the two biggest ones there are Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis. When you've got large funds, pensions, unions, or other large stockholders that have really large holdings, they don't often have the time to review the annual meeting materials for each and every holding that they have. So these recommendations that are published, how you should vote at the annual meeting, become extremely influential, extremely powerful. So, for instance, Institutional Shareholder Services, when they come out and say, well, we're recommending against your board if it's classified board, that's gonna be a really strong recommendation, and it's gonna push a lot of public companies to do it. ISS is the biggest one by far. Glass Lewis has a lot of market share too. And then finally, a spot that we're seeing a lot of more attention is the proxy voting policies from some of your largest institutional shareholders. The three biggest is Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And if you look at the public company disclosures in your proxy statement, who the largest holders of, there's almost always the top three stockholders for any public company. And maybe a generation ago, they really were purely passive. They were going to buy and hold and let the board manage the company. And over the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen changes to their policies where they're really starting to give more and more examples of when they'll recommend against, or they'll vote against director nominees and committees, where they're going to push back against management in certain areas. And we think that trend is, again, going to be accelerating. State Street was, I think, one that recently put in some policy regarding gender diversity on the board that was binding. And then the last one is your maybe a little smaller, but a little not activist investors, but long-term investors who are more active, and that's often unions and public pensions. You'll get a lot of proposals from them. You'll get a lot more calls from them, and they're definitely the ones that are putting out a lot more of these ESG proposals that you'll see. Best practice, we'll have it we have some clients that are getting calls every year from them on something new. The biggest example there was the New York City comptroller, put out proposals for proxy access in 2018. And by 2020, almost every public company had one, whether they had gotten the proposal or not. If the institutional shareholders, enough of them have a policy, it can gain a critical mass very quickly and see a really wide adoption throughout public companies. So people don't often think about those, but when they get together, agree on something. And the one you heard an example in almost every one of mine is gender diversity at the board level, and that's one that's gotten very popular with everything. And at this point, almost every public company of any size is going to have some binding regulation on that. And that's it for me.
Fantastic. Kelly and I are the gender diversity. So here we are. This is good. Good morning, everybody. My name's Katie Vickery. I'm a partner from Marston Clark's London office. I'm an international regulatory and compliance partner. So I help businesses that are going out into new markets and launching new products. And I can imagine you sort of sit and listen to all this, well, I do, and think, gosh, this is a bit scary if you're sitting in an organization and you're trying to figure out what to do with this, and there's so much regulation and there's so much pressure, if that's possibly coming from investors, from other stakeholders, maybe just from consumers or people who are acquiring your services, really putting pressure on you. So really there's quite a big pace of change that's coming about, and hopefully what you've got a sense of from all of us is that it really doesn't matter, to Matt's point, when you put your hand up, if you're a climate change denier or whether you're like, no, let's get rid of all the emissions in our company. It doesn't really matter where you sit. If you're running a business, you're running a corporation, these are issues that you're going to have to address and have to face because you're getting judged by it. Okay, you're getting judged. If it's not by the law, you're getting judged by other stakeholders around there. So if you accept that and you accept you're going to have to put some changes into the business, it becomes quite tricky then to figure out what to do. And I think that's really the change that we're seeing from our clients, is that, yes, they've got ESG, but it's like, but now what do we do with it practically? What do we do? And I was talking to a GC recently, and she said, look, actually, ESG touches absolutely everything the company does. This is not like a little silo, kind of a department. It touches everything that we do. And so how are businesses responding to that in the UK and Europe? Well, we see some people who are sort of appointing people to help. So maybe somebody who's appointed purely for ESG, maybe a chief sustainability officer is becoming very trendy. Some businesses are creating ESG committees or board subcommittees to deal with ESG. And, I'm not going to knock any of those. All of that absolutely has merit. But I think what we're seeing, and it's back to that point from the GC, that it touches everything. And really, from a governance perspective, this is something that has to be board led. So to make ESG effective and to make these changes to address the issues that we've talked about, the board's really got to have oversight. The board has got to be setting the strategy and setting the direction, and also making sure that the controls within the business are working. And it's by doing that you'll improve your metrics and improve the ways the business is operating in relation to ESG. So that's my first point. It's got to be addressed at highest level. This is not something to kind of delegate to one person. If you are that one person in the business, that is a struggle, I know, but have a chat afterwards about how you get the board with you on giving you some budget to deal with this. I think the other interesting thing that we're seeing in terms of instructions is the number of in-house legal teams who are trying to figure out what their part is in all of this. So the company may be very sophisticated in terms of its sustainability strategy, or more broadly its ESG strategy, but they haven't really figured out how the legal team can support with that. And we've actually got a quite an interesting project on at the moment with a big global consumer products business who is just trying. The legal team is sort of recognizing that the business is pushing forward a very ambitious sustainability agenda, but they're really not involved in it. So Matt and I are kind of figuring out what the gaps are. So how can that legal team upskill itself? What should it be involved in to really help the business drive that sustainability agenda? And we've had quite a few of those, of legal teams just sort of finding out their place. And what we're trying to do is really develop something quite practical for them. So both a risk register and an action plan, so that everybody actually knows what it is they should be doing. So I thought it might just be interesting to pick up on a few trends. So as US businesses, some of the things that you kind of some of the mood music, if you like, across Europe and the UK that you just might want to think about if you have any kind of business activities going on over there. And the first point I would just pick up is on supply chain. And to George's point about scope, the various scope emissions, I mean, that is just part of it. But I think what we're seeing is a huge focus on supply chains. Now, you've always had that obligation to make sure that you have an awareness and you do some due diligence, usually of your immediate suppliers. But this is kind of going a bit further than that. So it's like due diligence on steroids. And frankly, if you are a sort of a business that, you know, is potentially sourcing materials from parts of the world where there may be questionable labor standards, for example, the obligations on companies to do that extra due diligence is really at the forefront. And so I think the emphasis is on companies when they're either onboarding suppliers or when they're managing suppliers. It's really going into the depths of the environmental credentials that that business has. It's understanding actually who is supplying to the suppliers, so going down the various tiers of the supply chain, not only asking for certification for things, but actually carrying out your own audits of things. And I had a really interesting chat with a company it's been going a few years now, but their whole thing is going out into parts of the world, into factories, doing proper kind of ethical, sustainable audits, but doing it in a very sophisticated way. So that's been going on for a while, but actually this was one of the big issues with that is people sort of like, oh, we're getting the auditors in today, so all the kind of the staff that shouldn't be working there are running out the back door. This is a much more sophisticated operation where they're really looking at lots of different metrics to assess properly, is that supply chain functioning in a way that that is ethical. So you're seeing much more of a drive in that, and companies really needing to prove that. And we will see some of those requirements being mandated in law. At the moment, it tends to be quite voluntary, but we're seeing businesses, bearing in mind competition law, there's competition law in here, I apologize, but bearing in mind competition law, trying to pool some resources around this. You know, what is the point in going and actually auditing the same manufacturer 10 times over because they supply to many different businesses? Let's do that once, and let's do it in a sophisticated way and actually work together to kind of improve how that particular factory is operating in that part of the world. So we're definitely seeing that, and companies just trying to find their way to make that happen. The other kind of quite interesting point I just wanted to bring out in terms of supply chains, and again, it's quite an interesting sort of point around substantiation. So I'll talk a little bit in the enforcement bit about sort of greenwashing and where that's going, but the emphasis in the UK on really needing to be able to substantiate the environmental claims that you're making, and having some really good credentials around that. And we've got a matter going on at the moment for a large cosmetics company. They are headquartered in France, but they have global reach. And they very admirably wanted to come out with a sort of set of 20 statements all around sustainability and all the kind of ESG principles to explain what they wanted to do as a company. And in order to substantiate that, they got some big sort of auditing and assurance companies, people like Deloitte and Bureau Veritas, to come and spot check their data. So they're not looking at every single bit of their data, spot checking their data and writing a nice letter saying, hey, we're Deloitte's. We've looked at this. This is fine. All these claims can be substantiated. And they've come to us and we've said, I'm afraid not. In the UK, certainly, and pretty much I think in any country around the world, that's not going to wash. I'm afraid you're going to need to, in each country, consider whether or not you're meeting the substantiation rules in that particular country. And it's caused a real problem. And the French are sort of struggling a bit with why we won't just accept the Deloitte's letter and wave that in front of the regulator, but it's really not good enough. So real issues around supply chain substantiation. The other kind of trend I just really wanted to focus on, and Matt's touched on it a little bit as well, is just the extent of the green initiatives that are coming out of EU and UK. And this really stems from something called the EU Green Deal, which is a set of policy initiatives which are designed to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. So it's a set of policy objectives, and it covers really a very broad range of things from biodiversity to circular economy, building renovation to farming. So it's really quite broad. And there are kind of a number of major regulatory changes that are coming out around that sort of green agenda. So huge changes to our product laws, our product safety laws, big changes around packaging laws. So really requiring companies now to pay for the full life cycle of packaging. So not just when it's imported or brought into the EU, but actually when it's collected by municipal waste facilities, companies are now going to have to pay for all of that. So if you're a US business, you put product into the EU, this is massively going to affect you. Lots of rules about the recycled content of packaging, rules about single-use plastics. I was chatting to one of the ladies at the back there about, there's still quite a lot of single-use plastics being used in the US. We have quite a different feel in UK and Europe around that. And also labeling requirements. So if you don't put enough recycled content into your packaging, you now have this rather horrible label of a dying turtle that you've got to stick on your packaging. So the marketing teams, you can imagine, are not loving that at the moment. But yes, that now exists. And then kind of points around that circular economy. So trying to get a real shift away, so moving consumers from that kind of throwaway mentality to actually keeping products for life. So things that my grandparents certainly would have recognized, that you buy something and it lasts. So the emphasis now is on repair. So if something goes wrong with your product, rather than as a company, you say, well, it's fine, we will just replace your product or we'll offer you compensation. The law will now mandate, the primary remedy must be that you can repair this product. And actually, Mr. Manufacturer of the product, you've got to make it really easy for people to repair it. So it's easy for professional repairers to open the back of the case and get into it and repair it. And that's the emphasis. And that then, of course, breeds a whole new kind of, there's this lots of innovative ideas coming in around secondhand and refurbished goods. So we've got a big mobile phone company who's looking at, can we actually source phones from around the world and then sell it as a kind of refurbished product? So buy your vintage, if you like, or your pre-loved mobile phone, that kind of thing. So this is very much what is coming. So there's really great changes afoot. And I think don't be... embrace the change, recognize that actually you need to try and be proactive. People are trying to keep on top of the laws. We're getting lots of requests for horizon scanning and can you tell us, what's coming in, but also see the opportunities. So businesses are seeing those opportunities that ESG can present as well. So it's kind of both sides of the coin.
So just to key off of your packages with dying turtles on it,
yes,
we can move straight into enforcement.
We can move straight into which right. I'm going to continue and then
Perfect.
over to the lovely Kelly. So in terms of enforcement, we've got a slightly different culture, I think, in the UK and EU. We don't have a plaintiff bar in the same way, or we have companies or we have organizations that are certainly concerned about environmental issues and are beginning to kind of challenge companies who are potentially making environmental statements as to whether or not they're accurate. But the kind of amount of money that's at the end of that is much, much smaller than exists in the US, I think. Kelly's going to tell me I'm right here. So the incentive, if you like, is there, but it's more for moral reasons rather than because there's going to be a big kind of paycheck at the end of it. So really what we're seeing in enforcement at the moment is much more about the regulators really pushing forward enforcement and ensuring that companies are beginning to comply with the laws that are coming out. I think kind of there's two sort of examples I really wanted to give. The first one is about greenwashing. And so focusing on the UK for a minute, we've had the Competition and Markets Authority, which regulates both competition law and consumer law. And they, in September of last year, produced something called the Green Claims Code. So it's always been against the law that you can't make statements about your product, green statements about your product that are misleading. But what the Green Claims Code does is now kind of flesh that out and give business a much clearer understanding of where that line is drawn. And they put out their guidance, and then they said, and we're going to investigate various sectors, and we're going to start with the fast fashion industry. And sure enough, in March this year, they started with fashion, and they've narrowed it down to 3 companies, and we're acting for one of them, who are being investigated because the claims that they have made, the CMA are suggesting, can't be substantiated. So that is really interesting to see how that is going to play out. What ultimately will happen is these businesses will have to sign up to undertakings, so they will commit to future conduct, saying that they will change their systems and processes within the company to make sure they're adequately substantiating those claims. Those undertakings are published, so you can imagine every single business in the UK will be reading those undertakings, and that will set the tone. And the CMA is very much kind of sort of on the front foot with this. And so this will have a ripple effect across Europe as to actually what does it mean when you're going to say something like eco or sustainable. And it's actually, the bar is quite high. So looking at the full life cycle of the product. So from the moment those raw materials are grown in the field to the moment you throw it away, is your whole process green? And only then can you say, here is our sustainable product, or better for nature, or any of those kind of general claims. Otherwise, you have to really limit it down.
And Katie, just sorry to
Yeah, of course.
that links to the taxonomy point I mentioned,
It
doesn't
does.
it? So that's why we're having this sort of new dictionary, if you like, because you can't make those claims if not everyone is attributing the same meaning to those words, and that's why that's been quite helpful that we have this new taxonomy being brought in, isn't it? And it will help in terms of companies making those claims.
And do you see that taxonomy being on both sides, in the EU, UK,
There's an EU one, and the UK is bringing one in the next sort of 12
and the
months.
US? Will there be coordination, George?
I would suspect
I
there
would-
is.
there will have to be.
Definitely within the commission works closely with the UK regulators, but outside of consumer protection, that's not my area, but I would suspect that everyone's going to be looking at what guidance is out there. The SEC looked at the GHG protocols and others that were out there. So this is all going to be, I think, fleshed out and ultimately coordinated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. My second example, and I'm sure you will be familiar with it. It was a large commercial bank based in Europe who their group sustainability officer turned out to be a whistleblower, and basically came out and said, hey, all the claims that this company is making about how green it is and how it's investing in green assets, this is actually a misrepresentation. But what I think is really interesting is the reaction from the German regulator was to immediately go and raid the offices of the said bank. So 50 officials from the regulators plus the police turned up in reception. Just imagine what that must have been like for that company and those poor in-house lawyers to deal with it. And the investigation is still ongoing, but it just gives you a sense of kind of how seriously people are taking this. So it's for us, it's much more about that regulator push. Ellie.
So in the US, we are lucky enough to have kind of all types of ESG litigation on the rise. So we still have the enforcement by regulators, but we also have a lot of cases brought in consumer protection litigation and in shareholder litigation. So on the regulators side, even though we don't have the finalized SEC rules yet, there's still a lot of SEC action. ESG issues started to get a lot of attention in March 2021 from the SEC. And this is when the SEC announced the creation of a climate and ESG task force. That task force is within the Division of Enforcement, but it's really an interagency task force that kind of gets the support and resources of the entire agency. And the purpose is to find companies that were duping investors about their environmental risks or other ESG misconduct. And George kind of said this earlier, but the point was not to be the environmental police. The point was really to look at their relationships with investors and what they're presenting to the public about the environmental claims and the social and governance. At the same time that the task force was announced, the SEC also created a new position, which was the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and ESG. And the role of that position is to advise the agency on ESG initiatives across the entire division. So this is just another example of the SEC showing that not only is ESG a priority for them, but they're also ready to put kind of all the resources into it and really spend the time and interagency focus working on these issues. Luckily, they've been pretty straightforward and transparent about what they're looking for. So at the same time that they announced the task force, they kind of told us exactly the specific fact patterns that they expected the task force would be looking at. So for issuers, they're looking at whether they're falsely stating that they've met an ESG target or omitting disclosures of material ESG events. For funds, it's whether they're selling an ESG product or service without a plan as to how they're kind of going to follow through with that or how they're going to measure their adherence. And then for proxy voting, it's whether they're voting in a manner that's consistent with their customers and their clients' ESG mandates and in line with their fiduciary duties. So one of the focuses is really still on greenwashing. And I don't need to explain that again because I think we've talked about it a lot. But that's always in the background of what they've said is really one of their priorities and things that they're trying to prevent. So we've seen a lot of activity from the task force really in the last 5 or 6 months, which makes sense because SEC investigations take a long time. So when you're looking at investigations that last upwards of a year, they're really just starting to roll out now, and we expect them to keep coming. And right now, of course, they're limited in what they can bring based on kind of all the existing principles. But when the rules get finalized and we have all these new mandatory disclosures and requirements on companies, this litigation is only going to increase, and it's only going to go up from here as they get more scrutiny on their disclosures. So far, there have been at least 3 public companies that have faced allegations of misleading ESG claims with the help of the task force. 2 of those have already settled. Those settlements were announced at the same time as the charges were made public by the SEC. So in addition to cease and desist orders, like we were talking about in the UK, there was also a $12 million fine for one company and a $1.5 million penalty for another. And there's one more case that's still pending that's brought as a result of the task force's efforts by the SEC. And that's against a Brazilian mining company. It was filed in April, and the allegations are that the company made misrepresentations about the safety of its dams. And that includes the manipulation of safety reports and inspections. Unfortunately, following these disclosures and representations in 2019, one of their dams actually collapsed. And the collapse killed 270 people. And according to the SEC, it caused a significant amount of environmental damage. I think it was something like 12 million tons of sludge that was released into a river. So this is interesting to point out because, again, it's not the environmental police, but when you get something big scale like this, that's a flashy environmental crisis, and that's going to draw a lot of attention. So that company was traded on the New York Stock Exchange. As you can imagine, the stock took a real dive after that. So that kind of prompted the SEC to start an investigation there, and that is still pending now. And there's at least one more investigation that's currently ongoing into just some pretty straightforward greenwashing claims. So there's more to look out for coming soon from the SEC, we expect. Like Katie hinted, though, we have more. We also have consumer protection actions. Consumers care a lot about ESG issues right now, and that's really true when it's things that they're dealing with every day. They care a lot about it for their clothes, for their food, for their beverages. And the more the consumers are focused on it, the more the companies need to adopt the practices, but the more they also need to tailor their marketing to promote and let everyone know that they've adopted these practices. So that's opened them up to claims of false advertising, misleading ESG statements under existing consumer protection statutes, and false advertising prohibitions. And these are brought by a pretty wide range of parties, actually, that can be plaintiffs here. We do have private plaintiffs, but there's also state attorneys general, the FTC, and nonprofit groups that are also bringing cases. And the last big category that we have is shareholder securities litigation. Shareholders and investors are bringing derivative actions that are alleging securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duties, all based on companies' ESG disclosures. And these can be in their public filings, marketing materials, or even just things they're putting on their websites. And this is another area that I want to keep coming back to. It's on the rise, but it's only going to go up. The more we have disclosure rules, and as these get finalized and there's new requirements, it's going to keep increasing with kind of an expanded arsenal and increased scrutiny there. Just a couple examples of some consumer and shareholder litigation, just because I think they illustrate some good points about what's being filed, what consumers are looking at, but then also what's succeeding and what has more merit and is surviving past dismissal stages. One of the big themes you'll see is that what we're really looking at and what courts are looking at is misstatements. They're not as concerned with omissions, at least at this point. And when they're looking at the misstatements, they're looking for things that are really firm commitments and really presented as factual claims. They're not scrutinizing to the same level, kind of the aspirational statements and kind of puffery. One really good example of this is a case that was just recently dismissed in the Southern District of New York. And that was a putative class action against a wool shoe company. The plaintiffs allege that various environmental impact and animal welfare claims made by the company were misleading. Some of those statements included representations that the sheep used by the company for their wool were living the good life. There were also commercials that showed them kind of happily grazing in fields, just a sunny picture of these, sheep that were going into the manufacturing process. They also had statements about sustainability meets style and that they had a low carbon footprint. The animal welfare claims, the court dismissed quickly and said, those are supposed to be funny. That's obvious. They're puffery. That's just good marketing. The other claims, the more on the environmental impact side, those were actually dismissed because the company was really transparent about how they were calculating their environmental impact. So right on their website, they were saying, this is the methodology we use. This is the calculation. This is the result. And plaintiffs had a problem with it because they thought, it kind of goes back to the supply chain and the life cycle of the product. They thought that this methodology wasn't a good enough or an adequate representation of the environmental impact of the company because it was more focused on just each individual product and a really small part of the whole wool manufacturing process. The court said that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you didn't think this is an adequate representation. It wasn't a misrepresentation, and they were clear with you and they showed you exactly what they were backing it up with and how they came to this. So this is, that's in line with older cases that have shown that kind of these aspirational and subjective comments are pretty safe. But on the other hand, when companies are making really specific factual representations, those claims are more likely to survive dismissal and get a little more scrutiny. The best example of that right now is the case that's pending in the Northern District of California. Their consumers filed a class action against a canned tuna company, which alleged that their products were 100% dolphin safe. I'm sure it's not surprising of you to hear 100% is kind of a buzzword that's going to get a lot of attention. The court found that the company's fishing methods were not actually dolphin safe and allowed that case to move forward. It's still pending now. They're in discovery, but it's a good cautionary tale because I think it's such a stark, obvious example to avoid things like 100% anything. It's just really dangerous territory to be going around saying that you're 100% anything unless you're 100% sure you can back that up.
That's great. We're happy to have provided, you were talking about shoe companies, to have shoehorned in so much information into 1 hour. We received questions ahead of time from people, and I wanted to go through them. I actually was going to Katie and Matt first talk about the UK portion of it, and for those in the room, I can run through these, and then if you have other questions, we'll take those. For those who are on the tape, we want to make sure we gave you 1 hour if you only had 1 hour, but you're welcome to answer and put it on the.
I wanted to turn to Kelly because you had just mentioned something in your question that I received from the audience dovetails perfectly with what you just talked about. And you had mentioned about 100% of dolphin safe. Can you talk about what best practices companies may use to avoid, besides just that 100%, to avoid ESG liability here in the United States?
Both a civil and a
Yeah, so I hinted at it or talked about, even though it wasn't the main purpose of what I was saying about those cases. But one more thing that we can learn from that case with the shoe company is really about the transparency. They were able to really successfully defend themselves because they had everything to back up what they were saying. They provided all of that on their website. And when consumers came forward and said, we think you lied to us, we think you misrepresented, said, no, we didn't, and here it is. So if you're going to make firm commitments like that, there is a world where that's okay when you really have the receipts to back it up. And sometimes it makes sense, like this company did, to make that publicly available. That might, thwart from the beginning some of these lawsuits because in that situation, the consumer is coming and saying, you misled me. And you're saying, how did I mislead you? I told you exactly why and how I came to that conclusion. But even if it doesn't make sense to publish that data, I want to preach how important kind of the document retention and document maintenance and kind of thinking about everything you have that supports your claims and then maintaining that properly. So if you do get to the litigation stage, you have audits, you have inspection reports, you have details of the conversations and decisions that have gone into what you've done. All of that, of course, goes with the need for a really robust ESG compliance program. I hope that you've already gotten that point through our presentations, but that should really be the starting point, of course.
Can I
Go ahead.
add on to that? As far as timing, not only during the course of the operation of a company, when you're talking about risks from a compliance perspective, or a consumer at some point bringing an action against your company, the ultimate consumer of your company in an M&A transaction, the buyer, is going to be asking those same questions and looking for those same documents. We see that in the M&A context, due diligence. People are saying, okay, you've been making these claims for X number of years. Illustrate to us what is behind those. And so as a best practice, when you're talking about, what can companies be doing, keeping that on file, not just for the concept of, are we going to face something tomorrow, or is there a law on the books today that we need to be in compliance with, but also at any point in the future for private companies who want to engage in a sale transaction or want to go public in an IPO. Those documents and questions are going to be asked at that point if they haven't been asked previously.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Matthew. And it's a perfect pivot to Katie and to Matt, as we're talking about the US perspective. Do you treat the UK differently than the EU post-Brexit? And is it the same as the US perspective, as Kelly and Matthew?
Maybe I just pick, it's very similar in UK and EU in terms of substantiation, and it is actually that length of time as well that people sometimes miss. So the current CMA investigation, they're asking for documents going back 3 years. Another one with the CMA where they've gone back to the year 2000, which gives you a sense of how far back they're going, and the extent of the information that needs to be provided is huge. Yeah. So for these fast fashion companies, they're having to prove for every single product what claims did they make, what substantiation did they have, provide screenshots of all this, and it just doesn't exist in the fast fashion world, which is something of a challenge. So yeah, I recognize a lot of that and would echo everything that you're saying. The only category we have that we can carve out is legally privileged, which presumably would apply for you guys as
Yes.
well. Yeah. Okay. So so just bear that in mind. You don't want your classic kind of chief sustainability officer or whatever going, well, substantiation is rubbish. We can't actually make out any of our claims, which is a bit of an own goal for either side.
That
of
would
the
be a problem.
Atlantic.
That's not something to do, right?
That's not something to do,
Yes.
but
It's
it's
a worse
surprising
practice.
how often it happens. Certainly in my world, I suspect in yours, Kelly. Yeah, that's a really unfortunate email, but there we are. So I would echo everything that Kelly has said. In terms of sort of looking at where UK and EU is, we have some slight differences between the UK and the EU. Matt, do you want to pick up more generally?
Yeah, I think I don't want to bore everyone with Brexit. That is a very dull subject, but we do now in the UK have a very distinct set of laws and regulations. That is the basic truth of it. And if you isolate something like the environmental sustainability side, the UK government has set its own net zero target, and therefore a lot of the laws that are being developed in the UK are to that end, to help us meet that net zero target. As Katie said, the EU has its own net zero target. So you can already see that in that area, what's happening at the top policy level is then driving different behaviours in terms of law. What is, I think, helpful, particularly from a, if anyone's hearing this from a kind of a US company perspective, what the UK is inevitably doing is tracking what's happening in Europe and vice versa, because obviously there is pressure through, industry associations, action groups, soft lobbying to make sure that there is some continuity. And so whatever Europe is bringing out, there tends to be UK following suit. It may be a little bit different. So the classic example I just mentioned was the European SFDR, the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Requirements. The UK is now bringing out something similar called the SDR. It's almost identical, but there are just enough differences to keep us UK lawyers happy, because it means that we can advise on them in a slightly different way. So I think what we're going to see in this whole area of ESG is that there will be differences, but on the whole, the frameworks will be quite similar.
Everybody, that goes to
The metrics you were talking about before?
Yeah,
Go
absolutely.
ahead, Matt.
But the only other point I think is worth just stressing, particularly for a US audience, is across Europe, though, the difference in the way that regulation is actually being implemented
At local level.
at a local
Yeah,
level.
that's true.
And not to, it often comes as a little bit of a surprise. So, because the EU, yes, while the laws are overarching, each member state implements them in a slightly different way. And in this space in particular, we've seen quite a
Like
lot of
France.
divergence,
Yeah.
gold plating, rules coming in faster than perhaps in some countries and in other countries. So if you do have that kind of a cross-market presence, you do really need to get that local law advice to understand kind of how it's playing out, across the whole of Europe.
Did you have something to add, Matthew?
I was just going to say everybody's looking at everyone else's homework. And I was
Yeah.
talking to a gentleman earlier about the concept of scaling companies as you grow into different markets, that as part of counting the cost before moving into those markets, to ask the questions of how are those regimes similar or different than whatever I'm already complying with in the market in which I'm presently operating.
Yep.
I had two specifically targeted questions, one for George, then leads into one for you, Mike. And then I thought I saw some hands here in the audience, and we can do that. I know we're right on time, so quickly. For George, specific question was, what are the challenges in counting the scope 3 emissions, which then bled into Mike's question of how will the recent SEC proposals and these scope 3 dissents and discussions affect the stockholder activism?
Yeah, sure. So the challenges are, I think, several. Two very large challenges. One is, what is material? How do you decide what is materiality? Do you the environmental impact on everyone outside of your business as compared to your business? Is that the way that you would judge it? That's one of the points that the SEC made in its release of the proposed rule is to look at. But the SEC just really punted on this and said, look, it's the regular materiality standard as to what a reasonable investor would find as important. Well, who knows what that is? And on this context, I mean, some companies have a huge environmental impact. Obviously, the dam, automotive companies, oil and gas companies, but how about others outside of there? Obviously, technical companies you could see as well. But how about financial companies, banks? What is their impact on, and how do you measure that for materiality? And then the second biggest impact is, how do you get that information? The scope 3 is your effect on others, so the uses of your product. I mentioned earlier your suppliers, your customers, to the extent they're large entities that you could gather that information. But what about from the individual customer itself? How are you going to measure that impact? How do you get information about that? That's where I think there's a lot of sort of gray area and discussion in the overall community. It's sort of how are you going to meet those standards? So those are the challenges in meeting scope 3 emissions.
So then, Mike, how does that dovetail into your question?
Well, for stockholder activism in the near future, I don't know how much the climate change rule is going to impact that. I think the bigger one is going to be the SEC's recent rule on proxy cards, which is a big universal proxy card, which is a big change to how proxy contests have been run. And that's something the SEC has regulated for a while, but it's a pretty big change. So given the recent volatility in the equity markets, that can always lead to an increase in stockholder activism. If that comes this time, we don't think necessarily the universal proxy cards are going to increase the amount of proxy contests being launched by activist investors, but it's going to make it a lot easier for them to get votes. So the contests that are launched, for the first time, stockholders are going to be able to vote for some dissident nominees and some company nominees at the same time, where before they could only choose one or the other. So we don't have all the data about how that's going to play out, but we do think it is going to make companies that get a proxy battle, it's going to be easier for the dissidents to get a lot more votes. So, again, if anyone's worried about that, you can a takeover defense preparedness check is always a good idea.
Were there any questions from the floor? I see Emily saying we're out of time. So for anybody who has questions, we'll stay. I thank the panel. And this is the first amendment.